For 95% of human history, prisons simply did not exist. There were no iron bars, no stone dungeons, and no locked cells. A mobile band of hunters couldn't carry a captive across frozen tundras, nor could they waste precious calories feeding someone who didn't hunt. So if someone stole food, assaulted a neighbor, or murdered a clan member, how did ancient humans enforce rules without locking people away? The solutions our ancestors invented were far stranger, far more psychological, and often infinitely more terrifying than anything we have today. From weaponized public mockery and deadly spiritual ordeals, to the invention of blood money and the brutal code of Hammurabi, to understand ancient justice, we have to look at the world before kings and courts. For over 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in mobile nomadic bands. These groups rarely exceeded 30 to 50 individuals. In a group that small, total anonymity was mathematically impossible. Everyone knew who pulled their weight, who shared their meat, and who cheated. A band of 30 hunters couldn't afford internal violence or antisocial bullies. If an individual stole meat from the communal cache or hoarded berries in secret, the band did not draw their stone spears right away. Their first line of defense was psychological warfare, weaponized gossip. By discussing the offender's selfish behavior behind their back at the hearth, the clan formed a unanimous moral consensus without risking a direct physical brawl. The next stage of punishment was direct, merciless public mockery. Whenever the offender spoke, others would mimic his voice and ridicule his hunting skills. The band would compose satirical songs detailing his exact misdeeds around the fire. In small-scale human psychology, public humiliation is agonizingly painful. It triggers the exact same neural pain pathways in the brain as physical trauma. The Kalahari hunter-gatherers famously called this technique cooling the heart. For most minor infractions, public shame was completely effective. The offender humbled himself, shared his food, and re-entered the community's trust. However, if a criminal showed zero remorse and repeated his destructive actions, the clan deployed their second weapon, complete social ostracism. Anthropologists refer to this devastating psychological punishment as the silent death. No one spoke to him, no one shared fire with him, no one acknowledged his existence. He became a living ghost walking among his own family. If social shunning failed and the individual became actively violent or dangerous, the elders escalated to the ultimate nonviolent sentence, formal banishment. The offender was declared an outlaw, completely outside the protection of tribal law. Anyone from any band could kill an outlaw on sight without facing retaliation. In the harsh prehistoric wilderness, banishment was virtually a delayed death sentence. Deprived of the group's collective warmth, tracking skills, and defense against beasts, the exiled criminal succumbed to starvation, predators, or hypothermia within weeks. And what happened if someone committed the ultimate crime, cold-blooded murder? In a small band, executing a murderer was fraught with catastrophic danger. If Clan A executed a killer from Clan B felt obligated to take revenge, igniting an endless cycle of blood feuds that could destroy the entire tribe. To prevent civil war, early humans developed a brilliant legal safeguard. The tribe required the murderer's own biological family to carry out the execution. Because the killer was dispatched by his own father or brother, there was no outside clan to blame, and no blood debt could ever be claimed. Justice was communal, consensual, and enforced by the people who knew you best. This system of gossip, shame, and kin execution maintained order for 100 millennia. However, it only worked when everyone knew each other's names and ancestors. When agriculture forced thousands of unrelated strangers into permanent walled cities, the ancient power of social shame completely collapsed. When cities swelled to thousands of inhabitants, public shaming lost its sting. A thief in a city of 5,000 didn't care if strangers muttered about him in the street. And when murder occurred between rival merchant families or distant clans, there was no shared grandfather to order an internal execution. Instead, private blood vendettas erupted, threatening to burn entire neighborhoods to ash. When an eye for an eye leaves the whole settlement blind, societies are forced to invent an alternative, financial compensation. Across ancient Germanic tribes, Celtic clans, and early Mesopotamian kingdoms, law codes developed a system known as weregild, literally man price. Instead of executing a killer and triggering an endless family war, the murderer's clan paid a strictly calculated monetary fine to the victim's family. Every single part of the human anatomy had an exact legally codified cash value. In the ancient Anglo-Saxon legal codes of King Alfred, knocking out an enemy's front tooth cost exactly 6 silver shillings. Slicing off an ear cost 12 shillings, while a severed thumb was worth 20. The big toe was priced at 20 shillings, but the second toe was worth only 15. Even a minor scratch on the cheek had a distinct price based on its visibility. And what about the loss of an entire human life? A free peasant farmer had a standard weregild value of 200 shillings. A nobleman, high priest, or military commander was valued at 1,200 shillings. And if someone accidentally killed a wandering king, the compensation fine was a staggering 7,200 silver shillings. If the killer's family paid the full fine before the tribal assembly, the crime was officially dissolved, and all rights to revenge were permanently extinguished. If anyone took private revenge after the silver was paid, they became the outlaw, and the entire assembly hunted them down without mercy. Weregild was undeniably a masterpiece of pragmatic peacekeeping. It transformed bloody generational vendettas into manageable commercial settlements. It kept young warriors alive to defend the borders against external invaders. However, the system of financial compensation had one catastrophic moral flaw. It meant that the wealthy could literally afford to commit murder. If an arrogant nobleman disliked a vocal peasant in town, he could strike him down in broad daylight in the village square, toss 200 silver shillings at the feet of the weeping widow, and walk away completely clean in the eyes of the law. Meanwhile, if an impoverished farmer accidentally killed a nobleman's hunting hound, he could not afford the mandatory silver fine. To pay his debt, the court seized his family's land and sold his children into slavery. Weregild did not eliminate violence. It privatized violence for the rich. Justice was not equal. Justice was a luxury commodity. As cities grew into vast multi-class empires like Babylon and Thebes, this class-based bribery threatened to spark massive social revolutions from below. The poor demanded real justice, blood for blood, bone for bone, regardless of silver. They needed a centralized authority powerful enough to punish even the wealthiest lords. They needed laws that were unchangeable, absolute, and carved in stone. And around 1750 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon took power. He took the power of punishment away from private families and placed it entirely into the iron hands of the central state. He introduced the world to the concept of lex talionis, the law of retaliation. No more bribes, no more buying your way out of violent crime. The Code of Hammurabi was the world's first great masterclass in political theater. Standing over 2 meters tall, carved from a single block of black diorite stone, the stele contained 282 detailed legal rulings. At the top, a monumental relief depicted the sun god Shamash, god of divine justice, handing the measuring rod and royal scepter directly to King Hammurabi. The message to every literate merchant and illiterate farmer was unmistakably clear. These laws are not my personal invention. They are the eternal will of heaven itself. Hammurabi understood that written law possessed an entirely new psychological power. Before writing, laws were oral customs, flexible, negotiable, and open to interpretation. Once a law is carved into solid basalt rock, it becomes immutable, cold, and absolute. It doesn't care about your excuses, your family connections, or your tears. The text rules. The stone decides. The code established the first formal rules of evidence and perjury in human history. Law number 1 of Hammurabi's code was brutally direct. If a man accuses another man of a capital crime but cannot prove it in court, the accuser shall be put to death. This single rule instantly eliminated frivolous lawsuits and malicious slander in the city. If you wanted to drag your neighbor before the king's judges, you had better have 2 reliable eyewitnesses and stamped clay contracts to back it up. If you lied under oath to steal another man's estate, you suffered the exact execution the innocent defendant would have faced. Hammurabi's code also established the world's first strict consumer protection laws. If a surgeon operated on a nobleman's eye with a bronze scalpel and blinded him, the court did not issue a fine for medical malpractice. The executioner severed the surgeon's right hand with an axe in the town square. If a tavern keeper watered down beer or overcharged her customers in grain, she was bound with heavy hemp ropes and thrown into the deep Euphrates River to drown. The law was designed to instill absolute paralyzing discipline across every profession. No one was allowed to do sloppy work in the Empire of Babylon. However, despite its talk of universal justice, Hammurabi's code was brutally stratified along caste and gender lines. The code divided human beings into 3 distinct legal classes: the Awilu, the wealthy aristocratic elites and royal priests; the Mushkanu, the freeborn commoners, farmers, and artisans; and the Wardu, the enslaved underclass owned as legal property. If an aristocrat blinded the eye of a fellow aristocrat, his own eye was put out. Strict, symmetrical Talian justice applied between social equals. But if an aristocrat blinded the eye of a free commoner, he didn't lose his eye. He merely paid a fine of 60 silver shekels to the court. And if an aristocrat blinded the eye of an enslaved person, he paid half the slave's market price directly to the slave's owner. The law protected the property rights of the master, not the human body of the slave. Yet even with these profound class injustices, written law represented an enormous evolutionary leap forward from tribal feuds. For the first time, an ordinary farmer could stand before a public stone monument, read the exact rights he possessed, and demand that the king's magistrates enforce them. A king could still be cruel, but he could no longer change the rules on a whim. The law had become external to the ruler. It existed independently in stone. And what happened when a crime was committed in total secrecy, with zero witnesses? When reason failed, ancient societies turned to the ultimate court, trial by ordeal. To the modern mind, trial by ordeal looks like primitive, bloodthirsty madness. Why would any sane civilization believe that boiling water could determine guilt? Yet, modern legal historians and game theorists have discovered a shocking secret. Trial by ordeal was actually an ingenious, highly effective psychological mechanism. It worked because everyone in ancient society genuinely believed that God was watching. Consider the ordeal of the Holy River in ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia. Law number 2 of Hammurabi's code stated that if a man was accused of black witchcraft, he was forced to plunge into the swift, turbulent Euphrates River during flood season. If the Holy River drowned him, his guilt was proven, and the accuser claimed his estate. But if the river allowed him to swim ashore alive, the accuser was executed for perjury, and the surviving swimmer was awarded the accuser's entire estate and house. Now think about what this meant for an accused criminal. If you were actually guilty and you truly believed the river god knew your sins, jumping into the rushing rapids felt like guaranteed agonizing suicide. So, what did truly guilty suspects do before the trial even began? They confessed their crime, settled out of court, or fled into the desert as outlaws. Only individuals who were 100% convinced of their own divine innocence were willing to step forward and plunge into the freezing, turbulent waters. The ordeal was a massive, high-stakes psychological filter. In medieval Europe, the church developed the ordeal of hot iron and boiling water. An accused thief had to plunge their bare arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a heavy iron key from the very bottom of the pot. Their blistered arm was immediately wrapped in clean linen bandages and sealed with wax. 3 days later, the court gathered in the cathedral to inspect the wound. If the burn was infected, festering, and rotten, God had declared the person guilty. The condemned was dragged directly from the church steps to the hanging gallows. However, if the burn was healing cleanly without severe infection, God was said to have miraculously intervened to protect innocent flesh. The charges were dropped instantly, and the defendant was declared a saintly citizen. Historical records from medieval Hungary and England reveal a mind-boggling fact. Over 60% of people who underwent the hot iron ordeal were declared innocent. How was this possible? Were medieval priests performing real miracles? Not quite. The priests were performing brilliant psychological triage. Before the public ordeal, the priest spent days counseling the accused in private. He reminded them that God sees every hidden thought, and dying with a lie meant hellfire. Most truly guilty criminals cracked under this spiritual terror and confessed in private. The priest then quietly sentenced them to a fine pilgrimage or church penance. Only the defendants the priest genuinely believed were innocent ever touched the iron. And during the ceremony, sympathetic priests would secretly cool the iron bar, or instruct the defendant to let the iron slide quickly across their calloused palms. Trial by ordeal was not random barbarism. It was a sophisticated mechanism designed to extract voluntary confessions from the guilty and grant psychological exoneration to the innocent in an age before forensic science. Yet, as royal empires centralized and monarchies expanded, kings grew tired of relying on priests and gods to punish criminals. The state no longer wanted to persuade the criminal's conscience. The state wanted to obliterate the criminal's physical body in public. The age of divine ordeals was about to be replaced by the theater of absolute terror, a theater where punishment was designed not for justice, but for total intimidation. Welcome to the darkest chapter in the history of human punishment. By the imperial era of Rome, medieval Europe, and dynastic China, punishment transformed into an elaborate, overwhelming public theatrical performance. French philosopher Michel Foucault famously analyzed this evolution in Discipline and Punish. Foucault noted that in an absolute monarchy, every crime is a direct attack on the king's body. If you stole royal grain or minted false coins in a cellar, you did not simply harm a victim. You challenged the king's personal sovereign majesty. Therefore, the punishment had to be a public demonstration of royal vengeance. The king's physical supremacy had to be visibly re-established over the broken body of the felon. In ancient Rome, criminals convicted of rebellion were crucified along major highways. The Appian Way was lined with thousands of dying rebels after the defeat of Spartacus. The cross was not just an execution device, it was a permanent billboard of imperial terror. It delivered a brutally clear message to every traveling slave and merchant on the road. Do not dare challenge the supremacy of the Senate and people of Rome. In medieval England, the penalty for high treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The condemned was dragged through the city streets on a rough wooden hurdle, hanged by the neck until almost dead, then cut down while still fully conscious. His organs were cut out and burned before his eyes before his body was severed into 4 quarters. His head was boiled in salt and spiked atop London Bridge as a permanent warning to citizens. In Imperial China, the ultimate sentence was lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for patricide and treason, executioners methodically removed tiny portions of flesh, prolonging consciousness with herbal potions so the criminal witnessed the full sentence. Why did ancient and medieval states invest so much energy into public sadistic torture? Because before modern surveillance cameras, fingerprints, and forensic databases, the state could only catch a tiny percentage of actual criminals. Most crimes in unlit ancient alleyways went completely unsolved. To compensate for its severe policing weakness and lack of manpower, the state made the few criminals it did catch suffer with astronomical theatrical cruelty. The goal was not rehabilitation. The goal was deterrence through absolute terror. If you witnessed an execution on the wheel as a child in the town square, that memory remained burned into your subconscious for the rest of your life. For minor offenses, the state relied on permanent, visible physical mutilation. A thief had his hand severed. A perjurer had his tongue pierced with red-hot iron wire. A runaway slave had the king's brand burned directly onto their cheek or forehead. These scars were permanent, walking criminal records in the marketplace. You could never hide your past. You wore your conviction on your face until death. The human body had become a canvas upon which the state painted its violent authority. And for thousands of years, humanity accepted this bloody theater as necessary, until a radical idea emerged in the late 18th century, the invention of the modern prison. In the late 1700s, European thinkers like Cesare Beccaria posed a revolutionary question. What if the state stopped torturing human flesh and started punishing human time? Within a single century, the ancient theater of public execution and mutilation vanished. Punishment was hidden behind massive soundproof stone walls and steel iron bars. Instead of taking a criminal's hand, eye, or life on a public wooden scaffold, the state took 5 years, 10 years, or a lifetime of their personal freedom. The penitentiary became the universal operating system of modern global justice. Today we look back at the Code of Hammurabi, blood money, and ordeals as barbaric relics. Yet, if you look closely beneath the surface of modern courts and penal systems, every single layer of our ancient past is still alive and functioning. When a court orders a financial settlement or civil damages, we are practicing the exact economic logic of the ancient Germanic weregild. When a judge imposes a strict statutory minimum sentence to fit the crime, and when an online community publicly shames, cancels, and ostracizes an offender, we are tapping into the exact same 200,000-year-old Pleistocene tribal instinct that our hunter-gatherer ancestors used to humble arrogant bullies around the fire. Humanity has changed its technology, its architecture, and its tools of confinement. We replaced the executioner's broadaxe with concrete cells and digital probation ankle monitors. But the deep, primal instinct to punish those who break the social contract is the eternal, unyielding engine that built human civilization itself. And it is an instinct that will remain wired into our psychology for as long as we exist.